Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're just going to give it a moment for everyone to join, and then we'll get started. Okay, it looks like the waiting room is slowing down a little, so we'll get started. Thank you so much for joining us today for Understanding and Responding to CSEC Youth Through Best Practices and Trauma-Informed Lens in honor of Human Trafficking Awareness Month. We are thrilled to have Nikki Valila from My Life, My Choice here today to present this training. My name is Charlotte Hoff, my pronouns are she, her, and I am the Communications and Training Specialist at MOVA. I'm just going to go over some logistics quickly before passing it over to our presenter. This is a Zoom webinar, so you cannot be seen or heard as audience members, but you can see the presenters, ASL interpreters, and presentation. If you have questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A function to ask them. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. We do have ASL interpretation and captioning available during today's session. To see the closed captions, go to the bottom of the screen, click on the up arrow next to closed caption, and choose Show Subtitle. If you're having trouble seeing the ASL interpreters or closed captions or have any other tech issues today, please use the chat function to message all panelists, and we will happily assist you. It is now my pleasure to introduce our presenter for today. Nikki Valila is the Senior Director of Training and Partnerships at My Life, My Choice, where she leads a nationally recognized training team. She also oversees community engagement and strategic partnerships at My Life, My Choice, all with the aim to create systemic shifts in the support and services available to commercially, sexually exploited young people and youth at disproportionate risk of exploitation. Thank you so much for joining us today, Nikki. I'll pass it over to you now.
Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Tuesday. As Charlotte mentioned, my name is Nikki Valila, and I have the pleasure from being here from My Life, My Choice, and to give some of you who may be familiar, but for those that may not have ever heard of My Life, My Choice, let me start with, how we came about, how we were founded, and some of the services we offer today. So back in 2001, a young 17-year-old girl had been going missing from care. During that time, her Department of Children and Family social worker and other caring adults in her life were concerned that perhaps she was being trafficked just based on items she was bringing back after being missing, that she had continued to go missing, and oftentimes no one knew where she was. Unfortunately, on this last particular run, she never returned. Today, Boston police have still not solved this young person's homicide, but it is believed it was likely a trafficker or a buyer that murdered this young girl. Not surprising, after this happened, there was a lot of attention around, one, how did this happen? But two, how were we going to prevent this from happening to another young person? So at the time, Lisa Goldblatt-Grace, who is our co-founder and co-executive director, and an adult survivor in the field, came together to form what is now called My Life, My Choice. It's pretty crazy. We just celebrated 20 years, but back in 2002, there were just two people really leading training and awareness at My Life, My Choice. In 2004, Audrey Morrissey, our other co-executive director, came on board. And Audrey noticed a particular need in the community. That being, there was no current service where we matched adult survivors of the commercial sex industry with kids who may be at risk. And so in 2004, the Survivor Mentoring Program at My Life, My Choice was created. I'll talk a little bit more about how many kids we serve later, but it's been one of the largest prongs of the services we offer at My Life, My Choice since it began. Outside of our mentoring program, we also offer a variety of trainings. Today, you're getting kind of the Cliff Note version of our full day training. The goal is to provide you with additional information, maybe new tools, or different ways you could approach these young people in engaging in conversations about trafficking. One of the things I will say is that this training was designed in its best effort to be trauma-informed with the voices of survivors at the table. That being said, kind of regardless of how much we attempted to make this a non-activating presentation, the material itself can be that. So we encourage people to really take care of themselves, whether that means getting up to step away or to do what you need to take care of you. And so jumping in with language, some of you might be shocked. I just talked about being a trauma-informed training, right? Well, it's really important, regardless of who our audience is to ensure that we are all coming at this from this trauma-informed lens, but more importantly, understanding what we're facing when we talk about what's out there. That first term, teen prostitute, is unfortunately a term we still hear used by people that perhaps believe this is a choice, that a young person wakes up and makes a conscious decision that this is how they're going to make money. I often say, if we were to ask someone that truly believed that to be true, that it was absolutely a young person's choice, and we were to ask that person, what are other words or terms that come to mind when you think of that first term? Oftentimes we hear words like whore, slut, runaway. We hear problematic, maybe manipulative, challenging. Potentially there's questions of around substance use or being addicted to a substance. And so if we were to ask that person that believed all of those terms to be true about this young person, well, then who's responsible for this quote unquote teen prostitute? Who are they calling when they maybe believe it's happening in their own neighborhood? Oftentimes, the call isn't to the parents, that call is to the police. Because the concern isn't what's going to happen to that child next. The concern is remove the problem being the quote unquote teen prostitute. Now we're going to shift gears for a second and focus on that second term, the commercially sexually exploited child. Even if you know very little about this topic, look at the language included in that term. Now, if I were to ask you, who do you think's responsible? Or what are terms that come to mind when we think of this kid? If you could unmute, you would probably guess victim. Something happens very quickly when we change the language. This child is perceived as not having a choice. They didn't provide consent, that perhaps force, fraud, and coercion were involved. And so if I were to ask you the same question then, well, who's responsible for this child? My guess is police wouldn't be the number one guess. Oftentimes what we're looking for is that sense of community, right? This community response, that we're going to wrap this kid up in services because there was never consent in the first place. And so what's the difference then between these two kids? Absolutely nothing. But when we change the language, oftentimes we shift the narrative. We might shift who is believed and not believed, and or who maybe is deserving of services or not. But if nothing else, we have to be coming at this using common language. And so if I'm using words like prostitute or teen prostitution to describe the behaviors of a child, I can understand why that kid might feel judged or stigmatized, or maybe doesn't really want to talk to me. Versus if I'm referring to that child as someone that's been exploited, you can almost hear the shift in the tone and how I'm addressing this issue. And so there's no difference. And here's where it gets complicated. Talking to teenagers is hard, in particular, talking to teen girls. I've had to talk to a lot of girls who truly believe that this is a choice. This person loves me. Who are you? Like, who am I to tell them differently? But I always say the importance here is somebody has to plant that seed. And so when I've had conversations with young people and they're talking to me about their much older boyfriend that's 15, 20 years older, and they're telling me that this person loves them and takes care of them and buys them things, I then have to be able to say, you know, thank you so much for sharing, but based on what you've told me, I'm actually concerned that perhaps you're being trafficked. This is not when the music starts playing in the background. and the kid says, "Thank you, Nikki, for coming into my life," right? This is typically when they tell me where I can go. But the point is here, we have to shift the narrative. We have to show the path out. And how we do that is by not accepting language that's stigmatizing and judgmental. And so I know I'm amongst lots of people in this space that use acronyms in their work. The term CSEC stands for the commercial sexual exploitation of children. What do we mean by that? We're talking about children under the age of 18. One of the things that's important to kind of note, though, is just because you turn 18 doesn't mean trauma, symptoms of PTSD stopped, right? We also know that trauma, unfortunately, may stay with this person for a while and impact their ability to successfully navigate and minimize risk as they grow older. And so trafficking is not something that stops at 18. What's also difficult is that the laws shift and how victims are responded to. But for the sake of sticking to state laws and federal laws, we know that anyone under the age of 18 is supposed to be seen and treated as a victim. We also know it's a form of child sexual abuse. So if you're a mandated reporter, specifically in Massachusetts, you have a mandate to file on that. I suspect this might be happening to a child, even if I don't have proof or a disclosure. But one of the interesting things is, how do we kind of pay more attention to those early indicators, those grooming tactics that often occur before the child is trafficked? And so remuneration in the form of anything of value, back into the 70s and 80s, oftentimes we thought of the exchange of sex for money. But in 2023, we are hearing stories of kids having to exchange sex for a ride home in Uber, right? Food delivery, nails or hair getting done, new jeans, new sneakers, or how about just unexplained cash, right? And so what's so complicated is oftentimes these young people believe this is a loving, caring relationship. That's why I'm acquiring these things, because this person loves me. What they're not necessarily connecting is that to get those items, oftentimes sex happens first. So we as providers want to be paying very close attention to shifts in what kids are acquiring, items they might be receiving, especially if you know, based on their financial situation, this isn't something that they can afford. Now, I grew up in the 80s before there were cell phones and computers, and I remember my parents essentially saying, stay away from strangers and everything will be fine, right? And today, with the invention of the internet, strangers come right into our own homes, into our children's bedrooms. The internet has made accessibility much, much, much easier. And so our children who may have public profiles or might, they have non-developed, frontal lobes, aren't contemplating or thinking that the person they're connecting to, the person they're DMing or inboxing or friend requesting is potentially a perpetrator, right? If they seem nice, they must be, right? But understanding that our children today, especially with access to technology, are much more vulnerable than they were 15, 20, even 30 years ago. But we can't talk about trafficking without not also talking about, stigmas or biases that exist when we talk about this population. And so sometimes kids that are trafficked exhibit other types of behaviors, like not showing up to school or showing up to school late or being physically aggressive or violent. And so they might be, labeled delinquent or truant or bad or problematic. And one of the things we want to caution you on is we want to, of course, focus on safety first and containing the behaviors, but sometimes the miss is not taking it a step further to figure out what's driving this behavior. This is a new behavior or presentation for this kid. And so the goal is, once we've kind of assessed for safety, is getting to that underlying what drove this. And oftentimes it's being trafficked over and over again, but not having the language to articulate what's occurred. But also going back to, this young person doesn't identify as a victim yet. And that second term, promiscuity, I mean, to me, it's a dated term, but we sometimes still see it in music and songs. That word has very similar suggestive tones to it, like the word teen prostitute. The term promiscuous is often a very gendered term associated with cisgender females. But if we were to break that down a little further, underneath the surface, essentially, it's considered consensual. It's someone that wants to have sex or engage in sexual acts with lots of different people. And so this term is very similar to the word teen prostitute. When we're talking about kids that have been trafficked, we don't use terms like this to describe the behaviors because we know consent is never present in the commercial sex industry. And so before we go any further is understanding kind of the umbrella. Well, the umbrella of human trafficking. We hear a lot of different terms used in the state of Massachusetts, even outside the state of Massachusetts. And someone might say, well, don't they all mean the same thing? Sometimes there's similar definitions or different implications. But I look at when I'm talking about trafficking as human trafficking being the larger umbrella where all these different forms fall underneath. Labor trafficking, sex trafficking, and then of course any commercial sex act under 18 with force, fraud, or coercion or lack thereof. Specifically, what we're talking about here today is what does this look like in Massachusetts? And we focus on that term, commercial sexual exploitation of children. Very focused on minors under 18, regardless of gender or sexual orientation. This of course includes sexual exploitation. This also includes labor trafficking of minors. But the additional kind of clause we have in Massachusetts is anyone under the age of 18 that is inducing another minor, quote unquote, recruiting or grooming another minor is supposed to be treated as a victim as well. And so let's talk about some of the forms of trafficking we might see locally in the state of Massachusetts. Some of you joining this webinar may be from Boston or the Boston area. You may have grown up in an area or know of an area that used to be called the combat zone. You know, for those Massachusetts people, you know that's the area over by Chinatown, Downtown Crossing. Today, there remains 2 standing strip clubs that are kind of remnants of what was. I think back during the combat zone, there was prostitution was visible, right? You literally saw people on street corners. There were strip clubs and peep shows, and there was just a different sense of visibility we just don't see today. Horrible things happened during that time. However, at the same time, if I'm visible and I don't show up the next day, someone's probably going to notice. So there was a different sense of accountability. Today, we don't have the privilege of having visible prostitution in a lot of neighborhoods. You know, there's still some known streets or blocks or neighborhoods in some communities where you might see adults still out on the streets. And one of the things there is keeping in mind that those adults maybe got in as children and never found their way out, right? But today, I worry more about the safety of our children because they are invisible, right? They are put up and posted in Airbnbs, hotels, motels. The buyers are the ones coming in and out. And essentially, trying to find our children when they're missing is like looking for a needle in the haystack, right? Now, with social media and ads that are being posted, traffickers aren't going to put the child's real name. They're probably not even going to take a full frontal shot out of fear of somebody recognizing that child. And so it's much more complicated today to find a young person that's missing, especially on the internet. Child sexual abuse material is the new language when we're talking about or referring to what was once known as child pornography. I really agree with the shift in language because what we are viewing is sexually inappropriate pictures of children. And so calling it child sexual abuse material feels a lot more appropriate than referring to it as child pornography. I think other more modern versions of this is sexting. Now, if you have a child of your own, this has been a fear. I have 2 older sons. This is something I've worried about since the day they got that cell phone. Non-developed full, frontal lobes. They're in this quote unquote dating relationship. Our kids, take the picture now. They're not thinking about a day from now, a week from now, or even understanding that although that picture was consensual and you wanted to take it, in fact, you've disseminated child sexual abuse material and are in possession of. And so trying to talk to our kids about the legal implications of this stuff, but also not making the assumption that if a 13-year-old is sexting another 13-year-old, that it's per se trafficking. Maybe it's much more around cyber safety and intervention, around talking to our kids about things they're posting and pictures they're taking. Stripping, for a lot of the young people we serve, that's where it began. They were essentially told, you'll never have to have sex with people. You know, we're just going to take pictures, you're going to dance, and quote unquote, it's easy money. For some of our young people with low self-esteem, low self-worth, they've been communicating with what they believe is this very attractive older person online who has filled them up with confidence, has told them they can make a lot of money. And when that young person agrees to meet up with them, right, that's what they're holding on to. But that same kid that maybe agreed initially to meet up and go, a very different experience happens when they show up at that strip club for the first time. And they're told they have to strip, get naked, and get up on that stage in front of a bunch of strangers. And that same child that maybe appeared to be agreeing to do this is likely crying and begging to go home. At some point, the trafficker is going to intervene and that child's going to be put up on stage. But a very interesting thing happens. During that experience, those tears can quickly dry when dollar bills start being thrown at you. A false sense of love, of worth, and that same child that maybe got on the stage very nervous and anxious and scared may walk off feeling like I am somebody, and could be a very easy hook to get that kid to come back the next week, especially if they were allowed to keep the money, right? But what we know is that oftentimes, if they kept the money the first time, at some point, it's going to go from just taking off your clothes to essentially being turned out and sold. With gang-based exploitation, you know, every community, every city and town experiences different levels and visibility of gang activity. We're not suggesting that all gangs are trafficking children, but some are, right? And one of the things we know is that gang members, actual gang members, oftentimes don't disclose this, or this isn't known information to people, right? I've met many kids who, in a very early conversation, were building therapeutic rapport. Without me even really digging for this information, they come out and identify as a gang member, or I'm affiliated with so-and-so, or I roll with this group, or they're rocking colors or different jerseys, and they really feel like they belong, right? These are my people. They're providing me safety, maybe buying me things my family can't afford, but they're not taking into account the liability that comes with hanging out with this group of people that they believe are their friends. So maybe they're being exposed to drugs being cut or drugs being sold. Perhaps illegal firearms have been traded. Maybe this child has actually been asked to hold illegal firearms because they're a female and the belief is they won't be searched, or kids are told, you won't get charges anyways, you're just a minor. What they don't know is that there's mandatory minimum sentencing for kids, and those charges don't disappear at 18. But one of the things, you know, that's very interesting is because this gang has, one, depth, there's a lot of people. Two, probably knows more about this child than most. This child's very vulnerable, right? And so this kid who's been going to parties, feels like these people are their friends, probably is a little too comfortable. Guard is dropped. They don't sense fear or safety in the same way they did before. They almost become desensitized to the whole experience. And so when they show up to the next hotel party, and it's just them and maybe 10 gang members, it's not until that moment they realize there's real fear setting in what their role is going to be in that gang. And they're not being sexed in to become a member. They're being horribly raped to be turned out and sold for that gang. And so one of the things I always talk about with providers is when you're working with clients that are identifying with being a gang member, whether they are or aren't, why is this child telling you this? What do you know about this? And at minimum, how are you addressing safety? Survival trafficking is a term we see in literature and research focused primarily on LGBTQIA youth, right? And when we're looking at that literature, when we're looking at kind of what is the primary reason this young person may be exchanging sex to survive, oftentimes it's homelessness, housing insecurity, which started from or stemmed from being removed from their house, being kicked out of their home because their family doesn't agree with. It goes against potentially religious practices. It could be that they're in congregate care and feel unsafe, or they've experienced homophobia or transphobia. But the result is a minor, nowhere to go, living out on the streets, trying to find a way to survive. And for some young people, this has become the only means of survival, and really cautious to suggest choice. Because for most of these kids, if homelessness wasn't kind of the primary concern or problem, trafficking wouldn't even be happening, right? The last thing I'll say on the slide is intrafamilial trafficking. It's something that oftentimes goes under the radar because it's underreported. No child wants to disclose trafficking. It becomes even more complicated when the people that are supposed to love and take care of you are your perpetrators, right? Are your traffickers. And perhaps it started with early child sexual abuse that eventually turned into children being sold for a profit or for drugs. Oftentimes these same kids they turn middle school age and maybe they start running away or going missing, or we start to see behavior shifting and safety concerns. It's their attempt to get away from the pain, away from the harm, but they're usually very quickly judged based on the behaviors in which they're engaging, and not understanding that getting away from home was actually the safest choice. I think what's so hard is that oftentimes the first person they meet is a trafficker or someone that presents as an unhealthy relationship. But for that child, it feels better than the abuse they were suffering at home. Speaking for a few minutes about labor trafficking, I think different communities hear or see more of this. I know there's kind of myths and perceptions about what is labor trafficking. It could be, people being forced to work on farms or factories, or documents being held, right? And if you don't work a certain amount of hours or don't make a certain quota, you won't get your documentation back. Or it could be a young person being forced to boost or shoplift for a trafficker, and that product's then going to be resold for more of a profit. It could be the packing and selling of drugs. This is probably the most common forms of labor trafficking we see with minors in Massachusetts. I think the other element that's really difficult is oftentimes the packing and selling of drugs is with other family members. So it's people they know and trust, and the child not understanding that in doing this behavior, which is not chosen, they're actually being trafficked. And in some of these situations, it goes from labor trafficking into sex trafficking, kind of the longer they're in the game. And so I'll mention more about this later, but in Massachusetts, if a child's under 18 and you suspect that a child's being trafficked through labor or sex, the mandated reporting process is actually the same. I don't know about any of you. I don't actually watch a lot of news anymore for a variety of reasons. But if you were to go on your computer even and search human trafficking, teen exploitation, you would likely see images similar to these. What do these pictures tell us? Domestically in the United States, this is not what trafficking is here. Now, that's not to say that these pictures don't represent the experiences of some victims, because of course they do. However, if you've been in the field for a long time working with this population, 99.9% of the times, they're not coming back with any marks on their body or face, let alone handcuffs or shackles on their hands and wrists. So then we question, well, why do they keep running back to this person? If the abuse is so bad, what's leading them out the door if it's not these chains or handcuffs? In most trafficking experiences, kids aren't handcuffed to a bed. The trafficker is not even usually on site. And so right here, a trafficker's job is to mentally, emotionally, verbally break this child down to the point of becoming a physical prisoner. And so every time that child leaves their house again or goes missing from their program, the belief is it's going to go back to the way it was at the beginning, when they were buying me things, when they were kind to me, that honeymoon phase, right? That belief of it's all my fault. If I just would have made the quota, if I just would have done what they've asked, I wouldn't be in this position. And so it's not usually the trafficker coming back to take the child away. It's the child going back to the trafficker with the belief that I messed up. And if I can do better, I can be back in their good graces. And so this slide is to say, hang in there. I wish I could give you a miracle number that said after 6 times of going missing, children will stop, they will commit to treatment, and really be able to process from that place of victim to survivor. And unfortunately, I don't have that data or research, but what I can tell you is consistency, non-judgment, how you engage with them every time they come back, celebrating the comebacks. At some point, when that child is ready, you will be the person they will talk to. So never underestimate something you might have said 5 months ago that might actually right now start to resonate with what's happening. So in 2000, the federal government enacted the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. It's actually most recently been revised in 2019. But this was a huge movement in how we were addressing kids being trafficked in the United States. Essentially, if the government can prove that this person is under the age of 18, regardless of force, fraud, or coercion, that person should be treated as a victim. What's complicated, as some of you may know, we live in a country with 50 states that on any given day do not all agree. What I mean by that is, in 2023, there are only 34 states that have safe harbor protections for children that have been trafficked. What that translates to is a child from Massachusetts who should not be arrested and charged, who should receive services and be treated as a victim, could be trafficked to, say, Indiana or Alaska, where there is no safe harbor, and that same child can be arrested and charged as an adult. And so it's really important for us to know, what are the surrounding states to our state? What are their laws? How will children be treated? And informing our kids of their rights. Traffickers are not telling our kids, if you are picked up, you're going to get services. They're telling our kids, if the police find you, you're getting arrested and charged because what you're doing is illegal. And it's actually not the case. And so in Massachusetts, anyone under the age of 18, regardless of gender or sexual orientation, should be treated as a victim. What that means is, as a mandated reporter, if you suspect, that one's tough because sometimes it's your gut telling you, I just don't believe this story. Based on the signs and indicators I'm going to share today, it just feels like something else is happening here, that gray kind of horrible feeling. In Massachusetts, you have enough to file on concerns of human trafficking. And if the concern was labor trafficking, you would check that box. But the really important thing to know is as soon as you send that report, it's also getting sent to our local district attorney's office, as well as the Children's Advocacy Center. The result, a multidisciplinary team response, which lots of states are moving to. This idea that it's not just one provider at the table, it's several agencies working together to determine a safety plan, a response plan, and how to get this kid back if they go missing. And so it's been a real shift for Massachusetts. A lot of other states share similar laws, but it's important to know that we're not all the same. So I'm going to pause here and ask if there's any questions in the chat before I show the video.
There are no questions or any comments in the chat. If you do have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A found at the bottom though.
Perfect. Thanks, Charlotte. So in a second, I'm going to pull up a video. It's about 3.5 minutes long. What I will share with you is that you won't see any graphic images or videos of children being assaulted or exploited. Instead, I want you to pay attention to their voices, the youth in their voice, and more importantly, what they're discussing. They're interviewing one another, talking about how they met their buyer or their trafficker. Before I pull it up, I just want to note, for the first 10 or so seconds of the video, there's no sound. But as soon as you start seeing images, you will start to hear the video.
For money that I some girls, they don't have any choice. Like these pimps, they threaten you, they threaten your family, they threaten your little brother, your baby cousin, your nephew. A lot of girls that do have pimps, it's not fun.
Right.
You get your ass beat, you get your ass smacked.
Nobody wakes up every single day like, I want to have sex with a dozen of men.
Yeah.
Every single day, like for money that I can't even keep.
And as a young girl, we can't consent.
When I was first introduced, I was like 15.
I had just turned 14.
Like around 10 and stuff like that. A pimp never asked me my age. To me, it's like they don't care because to them, it's like we're money to them.
One was my uncle, and I was really close to him growing up, and I think he took advantage of that, and he introduced me to this guy, and I went because, you know, that was my uncle, and the guy was like, you're gonna go make money for me, after we was like miles away in the highway.
I didn't exactly find him. He found me. I was on a bus on my way to Urban Improv, and he just hit me up, and I looked through his pictures and stuff like that. And one day we decided to start seeing each other, so we met up at Franklin Park, and we seen each other, and then we started talking about having sexual intercourses.
When a pimp first asks you your age and you tell them 13 or 14, they act like they're like, damn, really? Okay, well, you could start off by stripping. You don't need to have sex. And it's all bullshit. That's how they get you started. And once you're in that life, it's hard coming back out of it. He just looked like a rich white man. Like, he was clean. He had gray hair. His skin was mad pale. He just looked like a businessman. And, like, I could just see his hand till this day, like he was married. That stood out to me so much because it just shows you that anybody can come buy sex off of you.
I've been thinking lately a lot, I want to be like a detective, but for the drug unit. I used to say I'm going to settle for something like cosmetology or mechanicing, but I feel like now I'm ready to become a drug unit detective.
I know this is, like, weird to say, like, I don't know, not a lot, but I feel pretty. And I feel like I don't have to hide today. Like, I want to speak up. Like, I'm okay with people staring at me today.
I'm happy and excited because I'm about to graduate 8th grade. It's about to be late. And I'm passing on my terms. Well, my second term was C's, but now I'm working on B's. As a parent, give your child more attention. Like, ask them how their school days are going. And for preteens and teens, just because you feel like you're not beautiful enough, you are in your own way.
Thank you so much for watching that. If anybody wants access to that YouTube video, I can drop it in the chat later or have Charlotte do it for me. But before I pull up the PowerPoint again, Charlotte, I think there's something in the Q&A.
Yes, we do have one question. It says, CSEC considers children under 18 as victims. So once they turn 18, are they no longer considered victims? Does the law and the services available change once they turn?
Really good question. Unfortunately, yes. And that's pretty consistent in most states. Now, victim service providers would probably try to tell you differently. I think we try to get really creative as far as continuing services if possible. I can tell you at My Life, My Choice, our mentoring service doesn't stop at 18. So if a child was matched with a mentor before their 18th birthday, they have that ability at 18 to make that decision again. Do I want to stay on board or do I not? And if they do, one of the empowering things that happens is they get to sign their own paperwork and decide who gets to talk to us and who doesn't. And so we are one service, because of that specific reason, understands that child needs that consistent, safe adult that knows this was not a choice, that knows it wasn't consensual. Even if they relapse as an adult, we are going to continue to work with them because we understand this form of trauma. From a legal perspective, however, I think there have been some great discussions, at least in Massachusetts and some of the cities, around juvenile judges and adult judges trying to have these conversations and trying to come to a common ground around how do we better serve victims of trafficking. And in some places, their hands are tied legally, right, as far as certain charges and whatnot. But I've heard more recently of diversion programs and attempts by courts to not treat victims as perpetrators, even after the age of 18. But from a legal standpoint, the laws say that once a child hits their 18th birthday, if Charlotte was in fact a victim, and at 18 and a half begins recruiting other minors and or is caught, in a hotel room turning tricks, Charlotte unfortunately can be arrested and charged with sex for a fee. And so I think we're, in Massachusetts, we're really looking at legislation. How do we shift laws? How do we create services for adults that don't involve incarceration? What I will say in Massachusetts, we're very fortunate. Not only do we have a lot of anti-trafficking agencies, we have a variety of survivor-led anti-trafficking agencies, not just for children, but also for adults. And so just for folks to know, in Boston, we have the EVA Center, and in Worcester County, we have LIFT, two amazing survivor-led agencies that also have housing options outside of case management and things like that to support adult survivors. So the laws haven't changed, but I think services have increased for adults as well.
Thank you for that. And I'll also just comment, I see it in the chat as well. I will drop the link to the video in the chat, and I'm also going to be sending a follow-up email to all attendees after this, and I'll include the link in there. We do have a couple other questions in the Q&A. Do you want me to go forward with those? Okay, perfect. So the first is just an observation. In thinking of shifting our language, this person often receives 51As where the reporter describes the youth attire at the time of response. For example, found wearing a crop top and short shorts. Lately, I've been contemplating whether it's helpful or harmful. Is it helpful in recognizing an indicator of CSEC could be the youth's attire, or is it harmful because it could possibly create an implicit bias now when providers interact with youth? So I don't know if you have anything to comment on that observation.
Well, first of all, I love that someone just put that out there. No one has ever brought that up in a training, but I do when I think of victim blaming, right? Of course, from a police perspective, if a young person's missing, it's important for them to know what they were wearing last, to the point of identifying them if they were missing. But I could understand your perspective that on a referral, right, or a 51A, that 51A isn't going to help find the child, but could be deemed as, yes, perhaps what a child's wearing could suggest concerns, but can also be very stigmatizing and judgmental. Kind of that background thought of, oh, they deserved it because of what they were wearing. And I'm not suggesting that's what the writer thought or believed, but I do appreciate your perspective on maybe it's less about the attire. For me, oftentimes it's more expensive clothing or jewelry or something of that nature that we're questioning, how did this kid financially acquire this? There's less and less kids that are actually wearing clothing that might be smaller or tighter that suggests that's in fact what's happening. And I'll just say, I'm a mother of sons, so I don't have to deal with buying young girls clothing. It's also really challenging as a female identified person who dresses in feminine clothes to often even find attire that might cover body parts that you want to cover, right? So I don't think we should say or suggest that if a child's wearing a certain type of clothing, they are in fact being trafficked. But I think that's a really interesting point to kind of uplift.
The last question in there right now is, are there services that you would suggest or extra support that should be offered to folks that may be over 18 now, but began as victims earlier?
Yeah, I would say first start with the youth serving agencies, just because we may have worked with them and know them really well. What's complicated is if they're over 18, you have to ask their permission, right? Can I reach out to this agency? Oftentimes kids will tell you, yeah, when I was 15, I dealt with my life, my choice. Are you okay with us contacting them? And it's not because we're going to hand you a file, but if we can say, yeah, you know, when they were younger, we were able to work with them. They did really well. They were really engaged. One, we know they were with a victim service agency that was able to provide some of that specific support. And I can't speak to other agencies, but if Charlotte was 16 when she worked with us and now she's 18 and a half, if Charlotte's interested, there's also the potential of rematching her to her mentor that she had when she was 16 or 17 if she's interested. And so that's pretty cool if a client is open to that. If not, my life, my choice, I would say a lot of these survivor-led service agencies can offer case management. And so some of the biggest things that I think come up for all 18 plus kids is housing, right? Being able to find a job or a steady job, being able to maintain housing and the job, right? Some kids are trying to apply for school or support from the government and just have no idea how to navigate this stuff. And so if you're working with an 18 plus adult that has experienced trafficking, one, you want them to have a sense of community, right? And so connecting them to a survivor-led agency where they can meet other people that have had similar experiences can really help create a sense of safety, right? And I'm not the only one, that isolating feeling. Two, you might be working alongside someone who has really kind of been able to get that help and support. And so it's a sense of like hope and resiliency. And I think most importantly with the survivor-led services, there's just things survivors are going to be able to support with that other people can't. And so having an environment where it's okay to have a bad day or not be completely regulated or maybe relapse on substances and know this service isn't going to close because of that, because we get it, you know? So I would say if after Charlotte, I can drop some of the names of these adult serving agencies in the chat, but I think outside of that, if we're a great place to start, if you reach out to us and we're not the best fit, we're happy to say, have you tried this agency? Call this person. We like to refer to one another. And so we can be a good support that way too. Any other questions, Charlotte?
Nope, that's all I'm seeing for now. Do keep the questions coming in the Q&A. Thank you for those questions and observations. And thank you, Nikki, for all of that information. I see something in the chat that says this is very informative, and I know that a lot of people find that. So thank you.
No, thank you. All right, I'm going to pull my screen back up. And so the young people just did a really nice job of kind of setting the stage for what we're going to talk about next. You know, you can look at trafficking from a lot of different lenses and argue, what is the real problem? Is the problem that children are being trafficked, or is the problem, the real problem, that people still believe it's okay to buy people in our country? And so we believe that if we can tackle demand, that is buyers who pay for sex, there would be no victims ever, right? My life, my choice would be non-existent because the need for our service would be gone. And so I want to share this study with you. There are some other demand research studies out there in literature, but there's not a plethora. And anecdotally, I think a piece of that is most buyers are not held accountable, which could translate to officers showing up on a sting, the young girls or women being held, but the buyers are told to get out of here, right? Because of their status or who they are. The other thing I want to say is that there is something anecdotally, if you were to talk to a lot of the adult survivors at My Life, My Choice, they would tell you that this man on this slide, he's just a Google image, represents who was often their common buyer, their average buyer that they saw weekly. Despite commonalities across demographics, the beliefs and attitudes of buyers are actually much better predictors of buying behavior than demographics alone. However, that being said, the average buyer is a white man, about 50 years old, makes 6 figures a year, married with children. Now that's really unsettling for a lot of people, especially if your partner or other people you know fit within that demographic. This can be alarming. And it also speaks to how the commercial sex industry continues to perpetuate itself. And we'll talk about racism and power in a few minutes. We also know, though, it's not just the white man that might be purchasing sex. Regardless of socioeconomic status, race, culture, and ethnicity, buyers come from all different backgrounds. But the average buyer is this guy right here. And I'll tell you why. This man is white. He likely has a very good job. He's probably connected or has friends who have jobs like judges or police officers. He may even have his own attorney. He's likely well liked in his community, which would further make people question, how could this ever be? It almost provides him that cover, that protection, that because of his social status, people would never even think that he could be guilty of this. But if you tried to buy his 15-year-old daughter, he'd have you killed, right? And so it's not the creepy guy in the trench coat that's perpetuating the industry. It's really money, wealth, and power. Now, shifting gears, I'm not going to read through all the common beliefs and attitudes, but there is something to be said. We look at buying behavior and compare it to rape culture. Sex is less about the sex and the pleasure. It's oftentimes more about the power and control. So we see quotes from buyers like, buying sex is masculine, it's normal. Prostitution reduces the likelihood of rape. Women are objects, sexually exploited women are lesser than others, AKA, I would never ask my wife to do this or someone I love, but I'm willing to pay somebody else to do this because they're less than. And this idea that sexually exploited people, regardless of gender or sexual orientation, enjoy having sex with you? Well, this is the farthest from the truth. To make that quota, to get that money, I need to be the best actor or actress I can possibly be, because a buyer's not looking to purchase someone that's crying in the corner. And so this just gives us some perception and perspective on why do buyers buy? It's clear through some of these beliefs that the impression is we're not causing harm, that this is consensual. I think if you were to ask most buyers or interview them, they would probably tell you, this person told me they were 21. This person told me this. And at the same time, knowing that person perhaps isn't that age, but not stopping or not going through with the behavior. Now, there was a study done in Boston in 2011, which was particularly disturbing to me because I'm from the Boston area. And so it felt too close to home. And they interviewed over 100 buyers. And some of the interesting things that came out of that study were men saying, if I wanted to buy a child, I knew where I could go to get one. There were other men that noted, even when they were purchasing, quote unquote, an adult, it was evident that this woman was probably working under the control of a trafficker, but that didn't even stop them purchasing that person. And so really just elevating, it's not about demographics, it's more about this belief that I can, so I'm going to. And it's clear that most buyers don't believe they're causing harm at all. Another thing I'll share is that there was another study done, I think it was in 2018, and it was an anonymous study. A little over 8,000 buyers participated, buyers that had been charged. And the question that was asked was, what would stop you from buying sex? What would stop you from buying sex? Now, if I were to ask you all that question, usually the number one answer is jail, prison time. And although that ranked in the top 4, the number one reason buyers said this would stop me was public shame, humiliation, sex offender registry, name being put in a newspaper. And so we're hearing it from buyers themselves, the lack of accountability. It is not uncommon today in newspapers, in the media, that even when the police have done a sting with adults, we still find the headings labeled as former prostitute, prostitutes arrested, prostitutes picked up, and the name that is missing is the buyer that was there in the first place. So we still have a culture where there's a lack of accountability for buyers, and we're still spotlighting or almost victim blaming even adults that are still in the commercial sex industry. Some of you might remember the case that happened back, I think in 2012 in Kennebunkport, Maine. Now, if you're familiar with that area, it's a very wealthy, upper middle class community. There's a lot of mansions, and it's a place people go in the summer to have, you know, some good seafood and be by the ocean. Well, years ago, there was the big stir in the community was this Zumba studio who had a female business owner and a male partner got busted by the local police because they were running a very large prostitution ring out of their Zumba studio. And part of the reason it got so much attention was, one, where it was located, the disbelief that it could happen there. But the bigger scandal was the debate over, do we release the buyers' names? And at the time, there were over 100 men that had purchased sex at the Zumba studio, most of which were judges, lawyers, police officers. And so it came down to, do we release the buyers' names? And what would the harm be in doing so? And so we have some really recent examples of how we continue to protect those that are fueling the industry. And so if the shift happened to holding buyers accountable and arresting them, there would therefore be less victims. And so thinking about like who's most at risk for being trafficked? Well, I would argue all young people are at risk, right? And so we really need to move from, we just need to talk to young girls, right? We're at a place where we need to be educating all children, regardless of race, ethnicity, culture, socioeconomic status, gender, sexual orientation, because by not having the conversation or assuming they can't be trafficked and they're not vulnerable makes them more vulnerable, right? And so what we're talking about here is anyone under the age of 18. So that's my kids, right? And then we look at access. Well, when I was a child, there were no cell phones or tablets or laptops. And so if you wanted to reach me, you physically had to see me on the street, right? Or you had to call the house phone. Today, even our young kids are growing up in a digital world where they oftentimes have access to technology at a much younger age. Now, we're not placing the blame on children, but we're talking about access and vulnerability. Some of our kids have multiple devices. And even as a parent, if I take their cell phone away, they're going to go to school where they have access to computers and technology, right? And so the technology is not the problem, but it's understanding that technology in a lot of ways is the vehicle in which traffickers may connect with our children. A lot of us work with young people and or have children of our own that believe they want more freedom, later curfews. Bottom line is, get away from me, drop me off around the corner. And if I'm in congregate care, I want that even more, right? I'm sick of the staff with the fanny packs following us around the mall. I just want to feel normal, right? A lot of the young people we serve, even young adults, they feel judged. They've been bullied. They've been ostracized. They might feel that they don't fit in or people don't get them. They might lack a social group or friends. And I think one of the things we're combating now is what kids see on social media and the perception that everybody else's life is perfect, is better. And maybe in some places it is, but also anybody can post a picture, right? And so our kids are constantly bombarded with, my life's better than your life, right? And then lastly, add in the element of being in love, falling in love, having that quote unquote first romantic relationship. And we think about then who's at risk for being recruited. any of our kids, right? I can helicopter parent all day. I can put parental settings on their phones. I have 2 sons that are pretty impressive gamers. They have the most sophisticated equipment. I can't be with them 24 hours a day. It wouldn't be healthy for me. It wouldn't be healthy for them. So I have to combat that sense of independence and freedom with conversations about cyber safety, about the realities of talking to strangers, about if people say this to you, letting me know, that pathway to open conversation without consequence. Do I think my kids are perfect? No. Do I miss things? Yes. But in 2023, we have to create that pathway of conversation, because regardless of how much control we try to take, our kids are 5 steps ahead of us, right? Charlotte, I'm going to pause there. I see a question in the Q&A.
Yes, and there's also one in the chat that says, do you have links to those studies that you were just referring to? If you do, I think you can just send them to me and I'm happy to distribute them to the group. The question in the Q&A says, have there been studies that address what is the average age children are brought into trafficking?
As far as the links to the studies, I don't have them offhand, but I can get them to you, Charlotte. Separately, really good question. So I can give you statistics in Massachusetts based on referrals that My Life, My Choice receives. The average age of first time being trafficked or quote unquote turned out, which means being sold, for those that identify as female is 14. For those that identify as male, it's 15. Now, again, that doesn't mean we don't get referrals for kids much younger or maybe older, but that's the ballpark average range of first time being sold. From a national perspective, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children a few years ago said between the ages of 12 and 15 for both boys and girls. And one of the things we often see is they have similar risk factors that increases vulnerability. But I would say 14, 15, which for most kids is around like 8th, 9th grade, right? Is that it, Charlotte?
Yep, that's the only question. Thank you.
You're welcome. So let's talk about, like, how does this happen? How do traffickers come into our home and recruit our kids while they're sitting right in front of us, right? Across the room, sitting on the couch. The other thing I want to stop and note is that I'm using intentional language. So I purposely have not used the word pimp throughout the entire training. And that's because that term in itself is highly glamorized. And what we know is that in the commercial sex industry, they're causing extensive harm. And so we refer to people that sell people as traffickers or exploiters. We also refer to people that buy people as buyers based on the behavior, and really moved away from calling them Johns or tricks, because that alone almost increases the anonymity to what they're doing. And so really kind of labeling the behavior that we're seeing. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, the term being turned out does mean being sold for the first time. Now, some of you are moviegoers. I am someone that likes to watch and read a lot of the same stuff I do for work. That's probably not good, but I think some of us are drawn to that type of thing. So I've seen a lot of the trafficking movies, Taken being one of my favorites, but Taken in itself, without any other knowledge or education, can really distort my viewpoints or education when it comes to trafficking. You know, this young girl was trafficked overseas while on vacation by a stranger. As a parent, this is something we fear, right? And so watching a movie like that, I could walk away with, don't send my kid alone, especially when Liam Neeson tells us not to do it, right? But the point is, force, although it's scary, is not oftentimes the main tactic that's utilized to recruit our children. Now, it might be used to keep them in line. So if they're not making enough quota, if they're not listening, if they're trying to go missing or run away from me, force might come into play, right, with a physical beating. But traditionally, it's not the way that they're recruited in. And so force today, I often think of gang involvement, just in one, how many people are involved, two, access to weapons, or the threat of a weapon. So the gun doesn't even have to be put to their head, but could be laying on a table in the same room. I'll never forget this story of a young person who was being forced to make this sex video. She was the only one on camera, but what you couldn't see was that there was a gang member behind the camera with a gun forcing her to take this video. And so force isn't the most common. Also, everybody has a cell phone nowadays. So if I try to take someone off the street, the likelihood of being caught or seen is very high. And so typically when we're working with young people, we hear elements of these other tactics. Coercion to me is kind of like that old school way of looking at like how you would blackmail somebody. Now, in 2023, it's really easy, especially if you're tech savvy, to find a lot of information out about people, especially if they have public profiles. So I could spend the afternoon trying to find out information about all of you. And for those of you that have less privacy settings, I could walk away with your name, where you live, maybe pictures from vacations you've attended, friends that you have, people you've tagged. The bottom line is, I would know a lot about you without ever meeting you. Our children are doing the same thing, but they're not doing it thinking that the person that's viewing their profile, the friend request that they accepted, is someone that's trying to harm them, right? They grow up believing developmentally that this person is everything they say they are. What you see is what you get. The challenge is oftentimes too, is that when our young people are upset or angry with us, they might go onto social media and kind of what they would say, put you on blast, right? Spilling all the business about who they're mad at and what happened, or they may have shared intimate details about their life, about relationships, or their trauma with this stranger that they believe they're a lot more connected to than they are. It does not take much virtually for that stranger to then say, this is who I am, this is what I'm about. And if you don't do what I say, this is how I'm going to use what you've told me, me against you. We see cases of sextortion where a kid sends a picture willingly, consensually to this other person. They believe it's private. They believe no one else will ever see it. And over time, the demands might get higher. The child no longer wants to send the picture. And then they're told, if you don't send me $1,000, I'm going to expose all of these pictures onto the internet. Perfect example around coercion, right? Befriending is oftentimes something we see in congregate care settings or schools. Keyword friend. Oftentimes the child that's recruiting them or grooming them is likely of the same age, gender, or even sexual orientation, which already kind of minimizes that fear or distrust of that individual. These young people have been trained on how to recruit, how to communicate about their trafficker, how to essentially sell the story about why they should go with this person. It might start with things like taking them out to lunch, paying for them, vouching for them, letting them sit at the same lunch table, paying for their nails to get done. It almost seems too good to be true. The relationship came out of nowhere. There's a power dynamic, maybe with age. And now this is the kid that usually says, well, I don't do that, but I've been at parties where I've seen people go into rooms, or I have friends that do that. Biggest indicator we want to pay attention to, that we're concerned about safety for this child, because not only are they being exposed to very vulnerable situations, they're also probably being groomed to be next. And then the last one I'll speak to before the question in the Q&A is seduction, which we see very commonly with cisgender girls that are dating this much older man, not 15 to 19, often 15 to like 25, 30. And what's so complicated about these situations is, outside of the fact that it's not consensual legally, is this young person truly believes that this adult loves them in a way that is healthy, that is normal, that this person provides them things that maybe they've never felt like they've had before. This is the kid that's the most defensive and challenging to work with because they don't identify as a victim at all. Charlotte, did you want to tell me what the question in this chat is?
Yes, so it may just be an observation, and if it's a question, the person can just clarify, but I'm still gonna read it because you might have some thoughts to comment. So it says, a 13-year-old says she was kidnapped and tied up, but the police said they never found evidence. How to help folks understand that it's not necessarily straightforward.
Yeah, just a really good point. I think, one, I don't think kids make things up. And two, I never want to second guess or disbelieve something that could potentially be true, even if it's outrageous. So for me, in that situation, if a young child told me that, I would absolutely file a 51A, even if I had limited information. And I would check human trafficking, because in Massachusetts, DCF will come out and investigate, regardless if the child wants to cooperate. And it creates that multidisciplinary team response. So even if this did or didn't happen, or if it were to happen again, we now have a team in place to better assess and support this child than just saying, she never, you know what, she makes things up all the time. And so for me, I'd rather be wrong, right? And kind of do my due diligence than not.
Thank you. And I hope that answered the person's question. If it was, if not, just feel free to put something else in the Q&A and we can get to another question. That's
Thanks.
all that's in there for now, though.
Perfect. So let's shift to signs and behaviors. And one of the things I want to start off by saying is, because a young person is exhibiting one of these signs and behaviors does not necessarily mean that they're being trafficked. Because as you'll note, some of these signs and indicators could be indicators in other forms of trauma. Oftentimes they're things we notice after a young person's been missing or after a period or pattern of going missing. And so again, not pretending like, I think I'm just overreacting. So a young person that's been in and out of state, or just missing from care. I had a young person that ran or went missing from Arlington, Mass, and ended up in Springfield, Mass, had no money, no shoes on or a cell phone, and somehow made it there and back after a few days. I have concerns about that. Who facilitated that trip? Where did they sleep? How did they eat? That alone is enough information to file on concerns. Visible signs of abuse, like cigarette burns, curling iron burns. We'll talk about branding and tattooing in a minute. But one of the things I'll just kind of say is, similar to domestic violence, most traffickers aren't going to leave visible signs of abuse because they don't want caring providers to notice, right? And to ask too many questions. Behaviors are consistent with PTSD. So this child has just returned, and we are now seeing a presentation that we haven't seen in a really long time, whether that's flashbacks, insomnia, bedwetting, needing to have a nightlight on, hypervigilance, that kid that's almost like head on a swivel, right? They might be very fearful of being around men or in certain places. They might be resistant to even going out in the community because perhaps just the fear of leaving the building is enough to stop them. And so although these behaviors can be frustrating and or challenging, especially in a milieu setting, we have to, again, go deeper than the behavior to try to figure out, what's different here? What might be driving this? Attire dress is not appropriate for the season or situation. Well, quite frankly, again, going back to just being able to buy what we might consider appropriate clothes can be really challenging in 2023, because what's put out into the stores isn't, from my perspective, always the most appropriate, but who am I to judge? And somebody's clothes do not determine or are at fault for people being assaulted or trafficked. Typically what we see, it's kids, again, very expensive name brand clothing, sneakers, jewelry, handbags, things that we know they can't afford, nor the state is paying for, or their family can't afford. How did they acquire that, right? And so for me, it's noticing the shift in presentation, the upgrade in clothing. We want to start asking a lot of questions. The phone is a big one. So I think the iPhone 14 is a new one. I don't even have that. Very expensive phone, often comes with a monthly plan. Who's paying for that, right? DCF's not paying for it. And so when I meet young kids, especially those in care, and or they have multiple phones, it's not about coming from a place of judgment, but rather concern around safety. The tattoo, now this is the one that's sometimes obvious in the sense of, if any of you have ever worked with minors, particularly those in care, you get the child that says, I want to get a tattoo. And you typically get to say, well, you need to talk to your DCF worker, right? I can't actually make that decision for you or give you permission. The reality is, whether living in care or not, if a young person is determined to get something, they likely will. That tattoo we're probably going to know about because they're going to throw it in our face when they return. Look what I got, right? And they're showing it off to you, kind of like, ha ha, you can't do anything. That's not the one I'm talking about. I'm talking about the tattoo that you noticed and not only looks new, it's a nickname you've never heard of because that was their street nickname aside, or the nickname of their trafficker. It's a dollar sign on the face, a barcode or a symbol that's unfamiliar to you. But more importantly, their entire body language changes when you notice it. They get anxious, maybe they're kind of moving around in their seats, they're trying to cover it up, change the story, they get very verbally aggressive, maybe even combative, or they shut down. Pay attention to the nonverbals, because branding and tattooing is a very common practice for traffickers. Found in an area known for prostitution, this could be a website where videos are posted or pictures are taken. The young person may not even know these exist. This could also be a location, like maybe there's a particular house in a community where there's other illegal activity happening. And if a young person I'm serving hangs out there, again, not coming from a place of judgment, more about just around general safety, but also like learning more about the people, places, and things in which they're associating. Language from the life. Language is always changing. We all come from different communities. You know, what is a term here could be called something different somewhere else. So it's not about having an ongoing list because things are always going to be changing. For me, this is more about humble yourself. If you don't know something a client is saying, instead of pretending, that won't actually save you for too long because it'll blow up in your face that you actually had no idea. I'm really comfortable now that I'm in my 40s saying to teenagers, I literally have no idea what you're talking about, to which they usually laugh. And kids like to teach us something new. They get over when they know something we don't know. Now, probably not if this child thinks they could get in trouble by telling me what it means, but more about just being able to say, like, I've never heard about that before, inquiring, and again, pay attention to the nonverbals. It's not uncommon. You know, areas known for trafficking used to be called the blade, the track, the stroll. If I meet a child that knows about that or knows that language, but is telling me they're not being trafficked, maybe not, but I'm still concerned about who they're hanging out with, environments in which they're, you know, spending time, not from a judgment standpoint, but around just physical safety and the concern that perhaps they're being groomed. Truancy from school can mean so many different things, and that's why we really have to pay attention to additional factors that might be coming into play. But I do think when we meet young people that are dating or associating with people that are much older than them, not even from a legally consensual age, because every state's different, but like, why is this 15-year-old so fixated on hanging out with this 42-year-old? And so I'm just having a general conversation about safety and trying to get the child to see, like, at 42, do you intend to date a 15-year-old, which typically is like, oh my God, that's disgusting. And this is where the conversation ends. But the point is, I'm trying to get them in touch with, like, why can't this adult find someone their own age? What's in it for them? History of multiple STIs, infections, abortions, and pregnancies. You know, abortion is a form of birth control in the commercial sex industry. You know, Massachusetts, we're very fortunate. Kids have a lot of rights and can access an abortion without parental consent through a judicial bypass. At the same time, we have to be mindful of how our own values and opinions might enter conversations as children navigate some of these things, and understand that if we're unwilling to support or get them access to the right services, they can always go to the internet, right? And find probably unsafe ways to do what they need to do so that the trafficker doesn't find out. Access to hormone injections. You're noticing physical changes in this child, Botox, filler, new makeup, binders, things that young person is acquiring to help pass in the gender in which they want to express. but also knowing they don't have the financial means to purchase this stuff, exchanging sex can become a means. And of course, there's a huge safety concern outside of exchanging sex, what they're actually putting in their bodies and is it even legitimate, right? New friends, older teens or adults, you have no information besides this person's name is money, probably not their birth certificate name. And so how do we inquire further, especially if this child has pushed away what they would call are their square friends, the friends that aren't doing some of the things they're doing. They've isolated, withdrawn from sports or hobbies, or they were once connected to their family, and now we're seeing them really pull away in conjunction with some of these other things. Perhaps what we're seeing is trafficking. And so what I'll say real quick, in Massachusetts again, is as a mandated reporter, we are required to file a 51A. We are also very fortunate that we can file on what's called an unknown perpetrator, which 99.9% of the time is the case because we don't know the trafficker's name. However, if you do know their nickname, you should absolutely include that. You should check that box, human trafficking, sexual exploitation, or labor trafficking to initiate that MDT response, but know that it's also going to the district attorney's office and Children's Advocacy Center to really create this collaborated team response that's ongoing. These are a few, additional resources. These are not going to solve human trafficking, but the National Human Trafficking Hotline is kind of like 911 for trafficking, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It is run by Polaris. They also have an amazing website with lots of different information for parents, providers. It's also a number a young person could call to get assistance to get back home. And then Greyhound has another program. Why this is important, and Greyhound isn't the only program, is because clients are told you'll never get home, I'll never buy you a ticket, and they believe that their only way back is through their trafficker. So it's important for young people to know they could go to the local police station, they could access potentially the Greyhound Home Free program, they could call the National Human Trafficking Hotline. But when they're ready, there are ways to facilitate getting back home. For anybody that might be interested in making a referral for a survivor mentor, if the child lives in Massachusetts, is under the age of 18, regardless of gender or sexual orientation, you can fill out a referral form. If they are connected to the Department of Children and Families, it's important ideally for them to make the referral so they can go through family networks as the billing source. It's also really important for the youth to know a referral is being made so that when we come out to meet them, it's not a surprise or a shock to them, and to really remind them it's a voluntary service. So even if all the adults in their life believe it could help, if they don't want the service, we won't match. But I think the importance as providers to know is we do hold on to that file. So if they change their mind and we've gone out and met them and assessed them, they can be matched after. So I'm going to end there with my information and kind of pause just to see if there are any questions or comments in the chat or Q&A.
First of all, I'll start just by saying thank you so much, Nikki. This was extremely informative, and I've seen that in the chat throughout this presentation, so thank you so much. There is one question in the chat, and if others have questions, we do still have a couple minutes, so feel free to put them in the Q&A and we can get to those as well. The question in the chat is filing the 51A the only way to trigger the multidisciplinary team?
So in Massachusetts, that is the trigger to at least get it started. Now, in some cases, this child has had 14 or 15 different 51As filed on similar concerns. Perhaps early on, there was an MDT already in place in one of the counties. So instead of kind of reinventing the wheel, you could go back to that original county to see who is the CSEC coordinator. So one of the great things is that in the 11 counties in Massachusetts, in most counties, there's more than one CSEC coordinator that helps to act as the liaison between all of the providers on a case, and to know that MDT, once launched, is an ongoing resource. So if Charlotte had gone missing at 15, really stabilized, stopped going missing, but then folks start to notice, we're seeing kind of some of these old behaviors we were seeing before. We're concerned she might be thinking of leaving. you can contact that CSEC coordinator and poll that MDT team for a virtual meeting on how do we support Charlotte based on what we know now, what we've seen in the past. And so they're a great resource. Even if other things have closed, they can remain kind of working with that kid, which is nice.
So that is all the questions that I am seeing. Brenna is going to drop in the chat now sort of our closing, which includes a feedback form if people don't mind filling that out. I will also be sending a follow-up email after this, as I said, and I'll include that link, the PDF of the slides, and the recording link in that. There are also some other resources that Nikki wanted shared with you all that I'll send. I'm probably going to have to send that in a separate email just due to file sizes. So look out for 2 emails back to back a little later today, or maybe tomorrow morning from me. But with that, thank you so much again, Nikki, and thank you all for joining us today. I hope you all have a great rest of the day.